Hello and welcome to the Business Today show. I'm Udayan Mukherjee. My guest on the show today is the grand old man of Indian banking. He's not only the founder and long-standing chairman of one of India's largest private sector banking institutions, but he also was the youngest to be the chairman of a public sector bank back in the day before the private sector journey began. Along the way, he's picked up many honors and accolades, including the Padma Bhushan, and lent his shoulder to some of India's biggest philanthropic initiatives. He's the one and only, the legendary Narayanan Vaghul, who's now penned his experience as a banker, his storied career, in a book called Reflections. Mr. Vaghul, it's a pleasure and an honor to have you on the show today, and thank you very much for finding time.
Thank you, Udayan. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be in your show.
Well, since you've called your book Reflections, let me start by asking you a very basic question. I mean, you've had such a long and storied career. Which part of it do you cherish the most on hindsight? I mean, is it the ICICI stint? Is it your stint as a public sector banker? Or is it the numerous philanthropic initiatives that you have immersed yourself in after your banking career?
It's obvious. I can identify myself only with ICICI Bank till my last breath. Of course, the philanthropic initiatives like Pratham and others are very important. But ICICI Bank caps everything. And that's about my life in banking.
But I rarely speak to a person who has been a chairman of a public sector bank and a chairman of a very large private sector bank. I mean, you're a rare exception in that case. So let me ask you to tell us a little bit about this perennial debate which is on between public sector and private sector banks. And a lot of people believe that a public sector bank can never run as efficiently as a private sector entity. The financial markets value the two very differently. Give us your perspective, if you will, on how you see through your unique lens as having run both these institutions.
My book speaks for itself. In fact, my book is full of anecdotes about what hazards are there in the public sector banking. Way back in 1969, when banks were nationalized, I felt very happy that banks could have last open branches in the interior of India. But the way in which the state controlled the banks, the state managed the banks, I suppose made me feel depressed. In fact, my tenure in public sector banking was very small. Then within 6 years, I left the public sector banking. I'm not counting my State Bank of India days where I was not a chairman. State Bank of India, I was working very closely with the chairman at that time. But if I count the chairmanship of the Bank of India, well, I was very happy to be in the bank and very happy to be with the people. But I just did not like the way in which the government tried to control the chairman and to control almost every day you will get a message from there to do this, to do that. That's not the way to manage the bank. And the market is right in valuing the private sector bank more than the public sector bank. It is not so much about the ownership of the public sector banks that matters. It's the way in which the state is managing the public sector banks that really gives a huge discount to the public sector banks.
Mm. Has anything changed since your time, Mr. Vaghul, you would say? Because you keep hearing these things about a tussle for autonomy for public sector bank management between the Reserve Bank and the government. There are still stories of government interference in giving out loans, etc. to this date. Do you think something fundamental needs to be done to fundamentally alter the problems that you just spoke about?
Yeah, the only way in which can be altered is for the government to step out of it. Way back, again, I'm referring to 1960, 55, when State Bank of India was nationalized. There was an implicit agreement between the first chairman of the State Bank of India, John Mathai, who was then resigned as a finance minister to join as chairman of the State Bank of India, and between him and the government, that the government will not interfere in any business matters, and internal administration will be entirely that of the State Bank of India. Only where it mattered, public policy mattered, the government would issue a directive to the bank. That promise was broken right at the outset. Very soon after John Mathai took over, he had to resign because the finance secretary, who was then at the board of the State Bank of India, issued a directive to the State Bank of India chairman that he should do something which is totally connected with the internal administration of the bank. And John Mathai did not like it. And that continues. For a long time, Reserve Bank of India was holding the shares of the State Bank of India. And all correspondence between the government and the State Bank of India used to be through the medium of the Reserve Bank of India. Well, I worked in the Chairman Secretariat at the time in 1969. Even Parliament questions would be sent to only Reserve Bank of India. And I was wondering why it was being sent to Reserve Bank of India while the matter pertained to the State Bank of India. Then it was explained to me that this is the arrangement. Namely, we don't deal directly with the banks. We deal only with the Reserve Bank of India, and it is for Reserve Bank of India to deal with the banks. I had to last it only till 1969. In 1969, there was a sea change. And I think the answer to that is that today there are no options available. The state bank, the state will have to get out of the banking system, and we have seen in the last 15 years, 20 years, how the few private sector banks like HDFC Bank, Axis Bank, ICICI Bank have been managed, Supertech, Mahindra. These are the banks which are really shining lights, and they should be able to give a message to the government that this is the way to go forward and not to stay maintain the status quo.
There seems to be a realization, though, Mr. Vaghul, that maybe the number of public sector banks needs to be shrunk down. So, what you're suggesting probably is the longer term answer, that the government gets out of banking altogether. In the interim, do you think we could do with a fewer number of public sector banks, shrink its size, and
Yeah,
hand over more to the private sector? How do you think this will work out?
no, it's actually my definition of a private sector, public sector, and the state sector are very different from what is popularly understood. My definition is that state sector is a state-owned sector. Banks like HDFC Bank, Axis Bank, ICICI Bank are really the public sector banks because they are owned by the public. They are professionally managed, and the management passes through a selection rather than a succession. This is the characteristic of a public sector bank, and I don't see anything wrong with that because we have been functioning efficiently as a public sector bank. The private sector banks are very different, namely where it is privately owned. That phase is gone. Today, the state will have to move from the state sector to public sector, and this is the way in which we have to move forward. And till such time it happens, Mrs. Nirmala Sitharaman in the release of the book, which my reflections day before yesterday or on Friday, she told me that privatization has but come to force from 2021. If that is really so, then what we have to do in the intermediate period between complete, uh, uh, I mean, disinvestment of the banks to the present date is the state to change its way in which it manages it. It should pick a professional board. It should stop interfering with the banking system. The Department of Banking will have to be wound up. That's the way in which we have to move forward. So that's the real source of all the interference. And once you wind up that, this is, in fact, it's not my argument. It's Mr. L.K. Jha, who was then the first governor of the Reserve Bank of India after nationalization 1969. Even this correspondence is very much on record. Um, they wrote to the Prime Minister, Mrs. Gandhi,
Right.
that you should not set up a Department of Banking. And the Deputy Secretary of the Government of India will do. The Reserve Bank of India will manage. And I was present in the meeting with the Reserve Bank Governor addressed to the nationalized banks, namely, nothing will change for you. You will continue to deal with the Reserve Bank of India. Government will act as a responsible shareholder. It did not do that way. That's a real problem today.
Right. Now, you make an interesting case, Mr. Vaghul. You say that it is not about private and public. Public sector character of a bank means that the primary ownership is with the public at large. So I want to ask you, what do you think is the solution for something like an IDBI bank, which the government is trying to sell its shares in? Because by your definition, the government could just offload its shares to the general public and reduce or bring its shares down to zero. However, the public appetite for public sector banking stocks is not very great, and therefore the recourse must be to find a private buyer for something like an IDBI bank. How would that work out?
No, I mean, if I were there, I would suggest a three-step solution. First of all, you will have to completely professionalize the management, bring in a top level people in the board to manage, and get a CEO who inspires confidence. And if these two steps are done and the government is staying out of it, then IDBI, just as we have done in ICICI, what was the position in 1991 when the reforms unfolded and ICICI Bank was not entirely a public sector bank, but was generally regarded as a public sector bank because 74% of its shares were held by the government owned agencies like LIC, State Bank of India, and public sector banks. How did we unfold it? We just marketed it in the public. We issued shares to the public and we made IPOs. First, we made a rights issue and then made an IPO. That's how we raised capital. That's a way forward for IDB also. I mean, to give it to another buyer, another bank to buy, there are innumerable problems. Like there has to be a technology coordination. IDB employing a particular technology. Today, mergers of the banks are not that easy because there are issues like manpower, there are issues like technology, because each bank will be having its own technology platform, and this can really not be brought together. So ultimately, I think the IDB itself has to be made strong before it is disinvested, and the disinvestment will have to be done gradually, and it has to be issuing shares to the public after the public gains confidence that this bank is being managed strongly.
Okay. Now, as the public sector shrinks in size and recedes, leaving more space for private sector banks, what would your suggestion be? Do you think India needs more banks, more banking licenses to be given
Oh
out?
yes,
Or do you think the top
yeah.
three or four private banks that you mentioned, they will become larger and larger?
No, that won't work that way. I mean, you have to have more banks. And after all, if we are really looking at 2030, we are going to be a $7 trillion economy. I think the banking size will have to reflect that. Today, we are a pygmy compared to the international. Today, technologically, the Indian banks are far more advanced than some of the major countries. But size-wise, I think we are a pygmy in the international community. So if it has to grow, there are dangers if one bank is allowed to grow very large because there will always be difficulty in so far as management of these banks are concerned. So I don't envisage it will be only four or five banks. It will be much larger banks, and this has to happen. And the planning for this will have to come now. For example, if we are really convinced with our objective that by 2030 we are really looking at a very huge economy, which is growing, possibly it's growing at 6.5%, possibly next year it will be 7%, 8%. We're really having that as an objective. We'll have to prepare the banking system for that. That would mean that we will have to think in terms of initiating steps of thinking in terms of more banks coming into the picture or developing the public sector banks very strongly by giving them the right type of board, right type of management, and then issuing shares to the public.
Well, the latter seems more problematic, as you know, Mr. Vaghul, very well. But what would your suggestion be in terms of to the new licenses for banks for the Reserve Bank of India? Because the Reserve Bank of India is very, very cautious about handing out licenses, particularly to anything backed by an industrial entity or a corporate house. What would your suggestion be?
No, my personal suggestion is obvious, and since that I don't think that industrial houses should get into banking at all, because it's if I really go back to 1969, the memories are very, for me, its memories still linger. Namely, the reason why I welcome the nationalization of the public sector banks is the industrial banks at that time, private sector banks were controlled by the industrial houses. And then a lot of cross lending used to take place. Then one bank's board of will lend to another company by another bank, and that bank will do a reciprocal lending to this. That sort of malpractices were very common in those days. I can't imagine the banking to be in the hands of a healthy economy like us, a big economy like us, what we envisage in 2030, has to be managed by professionals. And there are professionals are plenty in the country today to manage that. And the only way is public ownership and professional management. These two are the characteristics of any new bank. It cannot be private holding.
I want to touch upon another aspect which you are regarded very highly about is during your career or through your private sector tenure, you emphasize the need for gender neutrality in hiring and for promotion of executives in banks. And so many of your proteges or ICICI Bank employees went on to become chairpersons of very large banking corporations. Did that fill you with a lot of happiness and pride that you set it along the way, and so many of them actually were, India had so many women bank chairmen over the last 10 or 15 years?
I am very proud and happy about it. But where I quarrel is I did not do anything on that. I just said that, as I was mentioning, I did not differentiate between man and woman in banking. For me, what mattered is talent. What mattered is merit. And if the gender did not come in the way, I removed the firewall between the genders, and that the rest took care of itself. Because the women were really as strong as men insofar as professional management is concerned. In some respects, they were better than men also. At one stage in ICICI Bank, it was told that I was sitting and Kamath was sitting next to me in the board. The rest were all women were sitting there. But it was a very pleasant sight. And that's the way in which the general neutrality will later come. I read recently something about some criticism about India that only 27% of women have employment and the rest are not employed. So when we talk in terms of the demographic dividend, we are not utilizing 73% of our demographic population. So that is not a very good thing to happen. And so we need to remove a lot of barriers which are preventing women to come up in the any organization. It's not only banking, in any organization for that matter. I think the gender neutrality is a must for success of an organization.
No, it's remarkable to hear that you and Mr. Kamath were sitting in the board with surrounded only by women. It's such a remarkable story. But I also want to ask you on the same strain and I hope you'll humor me. Now, did it strike a bitter note when this whole Chanda Kochar episode happened? Because she was a woman who rose to the top, and then that very unfortunate episode happened. What was your reaction when you read about it and heard about it?
I would rather not comment on that because I think still there is what's known as sub judice. And this is a matter I don't want to discuss in public. Successions take place on the basis of the judgment which we consider to be proper at that particular point of time. And what happens in later on is something which we all make mistakes. We could, if it turns out it's a mistake, we have to acknowledge it is a mistake. But we could never have known. In any case, this cannot be a matter of public debate.
Fair enough. Now, let me come to the second half of your career, which is so focused on philanthropy. But you've lent your shoulder to some of India's biggest philanthropic initiatives. But how do you see corporate India's engagement with the world of philanthropy? I mean, there are some shining beacons like Azim Premji. But do you think a lot more can be done in terms of India Inc.'s attitude towards giving back to society?
Yeah. See, most of the corporate world really look at social responsibility as fulfilling the seesaw target. I think there has to be a conviction in what they want to do in the social responsibility space. And I think the emerging new term criteria, ESG criteria, it involves the S can stand for sustainability, S can stand for society also. And the society does matter. And a couple of things really dishearten me. One, of course, some of the beacons you had mentioned, Premji and Piramal and others have done extraordinarily well in the social space. But I used to wonder what happens if the corporate world can work together. I am told that something like 26,000 crores of rupees are being spent on the CSR. If they can do it, a collective effort and identify a collective plan for making this happen, then we can achieve a lot more than what we can do individually. This is my feeling, but I don't think it will ever happen. Because if one person does, they can do for 20 villages or 30 villages, but 26,000 crores of rupees is a fairly large sum of money in which we can make an impact in the society. And I don't think it's going to happen during my lifetime.
You spoke about some big institutions during this conversation. Who do you think of? admired the most among the crop of Indian bankers who've come up since your retirement? I mean, between, say, an Uday Kotak or a Deepak Parekh or Aditya Puri, I mean, who are the people who you think have done a remarkable job?
Each one has um, a- an aspect which is adorable. For example, Deepak Parekh took HDFC at a time when housing loans were not even common, and there are no resources available. I think he rose to great heights, and I think he took the HDFC also to great heights is undeniable. Same way, Aditya Puri also he took over the HDFC Bank, just as at the time when I started the ICICI Bank at the time. And he came from Citibank, totally new to the Indian environment. But the strides which he has made in the HDFC Bank in projecting it as one of the largest private sector bank is remarkable. Uday, Uday also has done a remarkable job in respect of this, and not to minimize the importance of what Kamath had done in ICICI Bank. Now, I may have been the person who is talked about as having lit the lamp insofar as ICICI Bank is concerned, but much of the work was done by persons like Kamath, and it's amazing the way in which you mentioned, and the way in which today the Sandeep Bakshi is managing the ICICI Bank. Waves which is creating in the market is quickly moved up to the fourth largest capitalization or something like that. That space. Every professional in Indian banking has done a lot to be cheered about, lot to be proud about. And I'm really proud of the professionals in the Indian banking space.
That's very generous praise, sir, from you. And you yourself have been such an inspiration to all of them, I'm sure. So it's been great talking to you, Mr. Vaghul. I look forward to reading your book and wish you all the best for the rest of your journey. Thank you very much for joining in today.
Thank you very much, Udayan. Thank you.
If you like the video, do like, comment, share and subscribe.